Hello! In this video, we are going to talk about Mary Pat Fisher's introduction chapter. She actually calls it chapter 1, not the introduction there, but it's called Religious Responses. And what you're going to find out is as we go through this chapter, we've actually already talked about a lot of these different kinds of concepts. And sometimes she's using a little bit different conceptual framework to organize her thoughts, and we'll note that. But I wanted to do it this way on purpose, where some of the things we're talking about, we've already kind of covered. But the one area that we are going to talk more about here is the way that people define or describe religion, what kind of categories their definitions fall into. And again, we've already introduced this, so this should work well. Now, in her chapter here, I'll go ahead and put myself down in the corner here. In the chapter here, as you see up on top, it says definitions of religion and reasons for religion. She covers both. And when you talk about, for instance, the origin of religion, just take that right there. Somebody could be talking about one of two different things, at least two different things. One of them, you could be talking about, say, what is the earliest form of religion that we see in human society? You know, what did people think in the ancient civilizations or in the hunter-gatherer period or whatever. And you could be talking about the first kinds of religion and how it arose. And so sometimes when people say origins, that's what they mean. Other times when people talk about the origins of religion, they're actually talking about the human creature and what is it in the human that makes the human incurably religious, drawn to believe that there is some higher order or more true reality, that believes that somewhere there are answers to the questions that the human being just can't seem to stop asking, and really wants to believe that there's a meaningful answer somewhere, but it certainly isn't in this world. Certainly isn't something that you can scientifically observe or test a hypothesis or anything like that. So wasn't sure what to title this, but we're talking about definitions, we're talking about descriptions of religion, we're talking about why people are religious, and we're talking about different forms of religion, all of this kind of put together. And so I don't want to categorize it. I'm going to kind of look at things, how shall we say, all kind of in one setting here. Let's see here. So you'll see down here there's a superscript 1 after reason for religion, and I say here, Fisher locates these scholars in specific categories that we have not replicated on this page. For instance, in the book, you'll notice there's a section called Defining Religion's Dimensions. And then there's theories explaining the existence of religion. And she talks about materialist, functionalist, and faith perspectives. And again, this is a different conceptual framework. It's fine. The one I presented to you by Catherine Albanese, I wanted to just have to be foundational. But there's many different ways to arrange categories. And it depends exactly what you are going to do in your study, which conceptual framework might work best. But I have not replicated her frameworks here at all. In other words, I'm taking scholars from all kinds of different categories, and I'm just putting them all, we're looking at them all just kind of at face value here. So we're going to start with Ludwig Feuerbach, and she talks about, most of the things on this page, she talks about in the book. There's a couple things that I made a note that it wasn't covered in the book, but she talks about Feuerbach. Feuerbach can teach us a lot. Feuerbach is a philosophical atheist. Feuerbach doesn't believe that God exists, but it doesn't really matter in this case, because Feuerbach makes an observation that really is true, and that is that every idea that human beings have ever had about God, about what God is or the nature of God or whatever, is a product of human thinking, is a product of human imagination. And Feuerbach is absolutely true about that. In fact, in all of the major religions, at least since the axial age, people tend to agree that the ultimate, whatever it is somehow beyond our comprehension, somehow beyond our perception, somehow beyond our understanding. And so certainly that would be saying, if you want to apply this to a personal God, for instance, that this is a being, if you can even use the word being, it implies non-being, so technically all of our creature words work very poorly, but that's all we have to use. But you're implying some kind of a being that is beyond anything that we can comprehend. And so when we think about such a being, we think about a being as a person, because personhood is the highest kind of life form or style of life that we can imagine. So we imagine God as like the highest form of person. But as we're going to see when we get to Hinduism next, they're seeing a God that's very much transpersonal. I mean, doesn't have any of the personal flaws or the personal limitations. And you'll notice this is kind of different from, say, the monotheistic religions where it's okay to think about God as a human being. And we talked about this a little bit before, so I won't reiterate the whole thing. But Feuerbach's important here because what he's saying is whatever you think about God, whatever humans have ever thought about God, what they're doing is this. They're taking their whole experience of life. They're thinking about everything they've ever experienced, okay? And they're taking what they consider to be the highest ethical and aesthetic values. That means the things that are most true, most noble, most moral, most beautiful, the best of the best they can imagine. And they're taking all of these things, and we're going to learn a term here, it's called projectionist, but they're going to project these ideas on the cosmos, so to speak, and they're going to call that God. And the reason they're calling it God is because it's the highest thing that they can think of, and certainly God has got to be the highest thing that they can think of. So they take all these great qualities, and they call it God. Now, you've never seen a human being that expresses these qualities perfectly. Human beings always fall short. So after, and this is again Feuerbach's explanation, which is important to understand, after we've taken all these best things and we've projected them and we've called them God, and then we recognize that we don't live up to the standard. We may have imagined this standard. We may have abstracted what, say, perfect justice is, even though it has never existed. We may have been able to somehow conceive to some degree of unconditional love, even though such a thing has never existed. So we're projecting ideas that to some degree we can conceive of, but that doesn't mean they've ever really existed or that we've seen them existing. So when we get done, we realize that, oh my gosh, this idea of God here is so far above me, I am not worthy. And so what Feuerbach could say is then what we do is we bow down and we worship the picture of God that we have created because it is so far above how we are. Now, this bothers Feuerbach, of course, because we're really worshiping something that we have imagined. And anything that you can imagine, if God truly is beyond your imagination, then if you can imagine it, it's not God. So you're worshiping something that you've created to take the place of the God that you can't imagine. But all of these good things that you came up with, they're the product of human thinking. They're the product of human ethical reasoning. And so it's almost like we're saying we're not worthy of being what we are, and we're worshiping, the best version of ourselves that we will never attain to. Now, so here let's talk about what's important about this. What's really important about this, even if you are a believer, and you certainly aren't an atheist like Feuerbach, what's really important is to realize that whatever you think about God, it is a product of human imagination. And if God really is beyond human conception and imagination, then what you think about God doesn't resemble God. It can't. We talked about this a little bit in the symbolism section, if I remember. But just to reiterate, when we think of a personal God, say, as a loving father, you might think of a father that, and this is the perfect father. Don't think of a guy that comes home drunk and beats you, but I mean a perfect father who would rejoice and be proud of you when you did well, and would be very, very disappointed when you, did poorly or did something unethically. And so when you do well, you like the fact that you think that your father is proud of you. And when you do something that is wrong, if you're a religious person, believes in a personal God, one of the things that bothers you the most is that you have disappointed your perfect heavenly Father who loves you so much. And in a sense, you've kind of made him sad. You've broken his heart because you haven't lived up to your expectations. And maybe he's going to be kind. Maybe he's still going to forgive you. But on some level, you've disappointed him. And but disappointment applies to changeable beings. It applies to beings that are subject to forces outside of their control. And so situations change, not according to their will, but according to forces outside of their control, and they respond in an emotional way where it either makes them happy or it makes them unhappy. We're going to talk more about this when we get to Buddhism too, by the way. It's an important concept. So when you say that God is disappointed, appointment, we think of it as like meeting at 2 o'clock, but appointment means something that you expect to happen. You have decided that this should happen, or it's going to happen, or you plan for it to happen. And so disappointment means that what you expected to happen or hoped for to happen did not happen. So that makes you sad if you're in the case of God, seeing that, poor Stephen sinned, and God's like, oh, Stephen, I thought that you were far beyond this now. Well, let's think about this now. We have to look at it from another way. Let's go back. Remember everything I've said. We'll come back to it in a second. Higher theology teaches that God has certain attributes that locate him squarely beyond anything we can comprehend. And let me give you 3 of them. Number 1, he's omniscient. He knows everything. Number 2, he's omnipotent. He's all-powerful. You can also say sovereign. In other words, he's in control of the progression of things. Nothing happens that's out of his control, and nothing happens that he has failed to perceive because, again, he knows everything and he's all-powerful. And the third thing is he does not change. And there's a variety of different names for this, immutability, but there's no force outside of God that can change him, make him better, make him worse. So he never grows and learns something new or forgets something he used to know or makes a different kind of decision as if he's becoming a better or a worse God. This kind of stuff just doesn't exist. And so that's fine. You're talking about a God that is beyond change, beyond our finite existence, that is beyond misunderstandings or lack of knowledge, again, beyond our finite existence, and beyond being affected by things that are out of his control. Once again, beyond our finite existence, which is fine. But when we think about God as a loving Heavenly Father, which, by the way, is a beautiful symbolism, it's a beautiful metaphor for some people, nonetheless, we're violating all of these higher attributes of God. When you say that you've disappointed God, well, first of all, obviously God didn't know everything, because apparently he didn't know that you were going to blow it. He's disappointed that things didn't turn out the way that he wanted them to. Secondly, he can't be all-powerful, because if he was all-powerful and in control of everything, you apparently wouldn't have done this, because this isn't what he would want you to do. And lastly, and this is the big one, yesterday God was all happy at you, and today he's all sad. That represents a really, really important change in God. His mood has changed, and you have been able to change God's mood. So in all 3 of these ways, you violated the higher attributes of God to think about God as a human being. And as we mentioned before, it's okay. I mean, all of the monotheistic religions and devotional religions would say that, yes, since God is so far above you, he understands that you can't think about him as he is. And so when you imagine him as like the perfect husband or the perfect father or something like that, that's okay. No foul. But as you are using these metaphors, as you are seeing God through these symbolic projections, you need to constantly be reminded that that's not God. That's the best way that you can think about God, perhaps, but it's not God. And the important thing is that while you are having some kind of relationship with God, or believing that God's involved in your life by using this metaphor, you have not reduced God down to this metaphorical personal idea of God that you can imagine. And it's important not to do that. Or you start arguing with other people about whose metaphor, whose symbolism is the best. Now, theologians don't think that's what they're arguing about at all. Conservatives versus liberals, they don't think they're arguing about that. They don't realize it. They're arguing about their definitions of God. But once you realize that all your definitions of God are basically just definitions of like the ultimate highest humanity or highest personhood you can think of, then you realize you're not arguing about anything about God. You're arguing about whose metaphor, whose symbolism is the most correct. And once you realize that, this would be the best outcome if someone is a little bit enlightened and the multitude of perspectives adds wisdom to them, you become less willing to fight about these kind of things. So there's a lot of good things to learn from this. And in the symbolism section, when we were talking about the features of religion, we did mention this. And so keep this in mind. Feuerbach is absolutely correct. Okay? Everything that you can think about God is something that humans have created. Now, Feuerbach would go the extra step, and he would make a conclusion that you can challenge pretty easily. Okay? And so let me take you to like the final valid conclusion, and then the conclusion he makes beyond that that's challengeable. Okay? The valid conclusion he makes is that therefore, every conception of God that has ever existed is a product of human creation. Check. Correct. Okay? But then he would go on and say that since you can demonstrate that every idea of God is just a human creation, then all ideas of God are human creations, and God, in fact, doesn't exist and never has. We've created him because we need him to exist. At this point, you can challenge this. And the academic principle, and by the way, this pertains in all kinds of different areas, not just here, as you will see. The principle is that the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. I'll say it again. The absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. We do not know that there is intelligent life on any other planets. But does that mean, since we have no evidence of any kind that there's intelligent life anywhere else in the universe, does that mean there's no intelligent life? Of course not. It just means we don't know. We don't have the data. And so, again, when you take that extra step and say, since there's no data that can confirm the existence of God, therefore he doesn't exist, you've engaged in a fallacy. And actually, it's a fallacy that, in a sense, is built on a foundation of correct thinking. And that is that any idea of God can't be God, and what God really is, you can't possibly think about or empirically observe or test by some scientific hypotheses. So you're kind of opening up with that kind of idea with transcendence, but then you're saying that because you cannot test for the existence of something greater than you, therefore it doesn't exist. And that, of course, is a fallacy. So, but what Feuerbach teaches us about the idea, our ideas of God being of our own creation, that is very, very important. And this is why God is always changing. 150 years ago in this country, there were people, especially in the southern states, who were pulling up their Bibles and, opening to the book of Leviticus and saying, it tells me right here, about how to treat my slaves and when it's okay to have them and all of this. And they're defending the idea that God has somehow sanctioned slavery. So they're believing in a God that, for many different reasons thinks slavery's okay. And this is a deeper subject I can't get into now. Actually doing a research paper on the progression of slavery and the way it's been legitimated religiously, especially in Christianity up until this point. But my point here is today, if I stood in front of a face-to-face class and I asked my students, say, how many people think that God, if God exists, whatever God must be, the way you think about God, the highest way, how many people think that God is in favor of slavery, that God would like for us to still have lighter-skinned people owning darker-skinned people? How many people think that's God's will? And of course, no students are ever going to raise their hand. If any student did think that, they wouldn't raise their hand because they'd probably get beat up in the parking lot on the way to their car and probably would deserve it. But my point is, 150 years ago, half the Christians in this country thought that God was in favor of slavery. So did God change his mind? Did God look at this war that we fought where at least 650,000, maybe a couple 100,000 more people died, and God say, wow, you humans are really passionate about this. Okay. Chill out. Let me rethink this. Okay, well, I guess you're right, humans. Maybe there shouldn't be slavery. Did God change his mind and become a more ethical God? Well, again, if God can't change, then who changed? We did. And so back when, assuming you were someone who ever thought that slavery was okay, obviously, maybe you never have, of course, but at that point in time, you thought about a God that somehow allowed slavery and institutionalized slavery in some kind of a righteous form, and today people who believe in God don't believe that at all. So what's happened? If God hasn't changed, but only our ideas of God have changed, what's happening is because we've become more ethical, because we've ethically evolved, we're projecting a more ethical idea of God today than we were 150 years ago, than we were 1,000 years ago, than we were 2,000 years ago, or better yet, than we were 3,000 years ago, when in the early Israelite period, leaders actually thought that God was telling them to go into different cities and, annihilate everybody, men, women, children, even kill the cattle, because the whole society was just so wicked, everything had to be destroyed. And the idea that the good should be destroyed with the wicked, well, 1,000 years before that time, Abraham challenged God about that and came to the conclusion that no, God doesn't destroy the good with the wicked as a rule. And if there's enough good people there, maybe he'll even forego his judgment altogether just because of the good people. So here it is 1,000 years later, and yet still people are not living by that highest ideal. They're going into battle thinking God is on our side and God wants us to kill everybody else. Now this is 3,000 years ago, actually probably more like closer to 3,400 years ago, depending how you date the Exodus. But there are still people today that are hanging on to this idea that God is some kind of like a military God or something, that if there are nations of the earth that haven't pleased him, we might be called to go and blow them off the face of the earth. And there are still some people hanging on to these ideas, but for the most part, our society has evolved ethically. And most people do not, they'd have a hard time believing in a God like that, because one of the principles is, my God has to be at least as ethical as I am. I can't worship a God that's less ethical than me. If I can see good in someone that ought to be recognized, and the God that you're telling me about can't see it, then I can't worship your God, because I'm more righteous than your God. I'm able to see beauty in something, and your God can't see it. Well, that kind of elevates me above the ethics of your God. And so we have to have a God that's far enough above us that God can be a good ethical example, give us ideals to strive for. And I can't, of course, strive for ideals that are below where I'm at right now, nor can I worship a God or pattern myself, after a God that's so much less ethical than I am. And I could talk so much more about that, but we don't have time. So this is what's really important, just thinking about projectionist ideas. And the term projectionism just kind of means that we project our idea of ultimate reality on the cosmos, and it becomes some kind of a law that comes back and judges us. And this is an interesting, by the way, sociology of religion. This is a very interesting concept. If anybody is interested in this kind of thing, there is a book written by Peter Berger, who's Boston College, called The Sacred Canopy. And the first 4 chapters or so are also very, very interesting in terms of how we create the laws, we create the ethics or the theology, whatever, that once we project it and we say, yes, this is an objective reality, then it comes back to judge us. And it's a lot like making laws. Let's say I'm the one that authors and pushes through a law that says, you can't murder anyone, and the law is passed, and then I go out and I murder somebody. The law's going to judge me. Yes, I might have created the law. I might be responsible for the law existing, but once that law is projected, now I'm subject to the law that I've created, and that law will punish me if I break it. And these are all projectionist ideas, but it's an important thing to realize if you're studying sociology, especially if you're studying theology, if you're studying philosophy, you'll think a lot about projectionist ideas. Moving on, Karl Marx. Now, you're going to have to forget all of the crazy things that people are thinking about today. And of course, I mean the kind of ideas where anything associated with Karl Marx or socialism or communism or anything like that is somehow, created by the devil in hell and Christians must fight it. Just chill all that out for a second. Karl Marx is a guy who actually was a fairly ethical individual. Now, you don't have to agree with his politics or sociology or philosophy or anything else, but he wasn't trying to destroy humanity or hurt anybody. He was actually trying to create a better world, however misguided you might think he was. And one of the things that Karl Marx, for the purpose of this class, I have to kind of be narrow here on my focus, but one of the things that Karl Marx really, really did not like was the way that religion legitimated the social order, the social stratification, the inequality between the lowest levels and the highest levels of society. And even when we get to a point in the axial age where for the first time we can think of like humans having some essence where on some level, they're equal or have equal right to be or to be happy, and that there's some other world where in fact that equality will be realized. Nonetheless, this world doesn't change to be any more like that. Society can't function when everybody's equal. That's anarchy. So you can't really, in a small tribe, maybe you can have egalitarianism, but not in a big society made up of different classes of people and so on. So the point is, you should be in some way trying to constantly evolve to make your society more just. But one of the things that prevented any kind of a positive rebellion was religious legitimation. Religious legitimation in terms of the stratification of society is that which says that on some level, the way society is the way God wills it to be, and it's on purpose. And the people that are in power are the people God has put in power, and if you happen to have a really crappy gig, working in a factory 16 hours a day in dangerous, unhealthy conditions for horrible wages to go home and get 6 hours sleep and come up and do it again, yeah, it kind of sucks, but you know what? This life's really short, and if I'm faithful and I'm a good factory worker and I do it for Jesus, then I've got all eternity, to shine like the sun and reign with the King. And so this brief period where God's will for me is to be in this, distasteful position in life. Okay, I'll be faithful because I'm looking for something better. That's religious legitimation in a nutshell. And Karl Marx hated this because with the Industrial Revolution, what happened was people were no longer, the majority of people are no longer involved in different kinds of agriculture. This is when things really start changing. And we have more and more people, especially in and around the cities and in the industrial areas, that are involved as laborers in the factories. We have machines now that can create products much more quickly and much more cheaply. And so the opportunity is for somebody to make a heck of a lot of money. And it's the people that are owning the factories. In fact, in this position in history, the very, very successful merchants or business owners are actually ending up many times with more power in society than the nobles, than the aristocrats, than those that are related to royalty or that own the great expanses of land. They're losing their power. It's all about these people that are making tons of money. But the way they're making tons of money, yes, they've got the machines. Yes, they've been able to build them or buy them or whatever and set up the factory. But somebody's got to run the factory. The machines don't do everything. Somebody has to run the machines. Lots of people. And so this is where many people in an urban area or industrial area are actually employed. They're getting paid horrible money. And again, it's very bad working conditions. And the people that are in charge of the factories don't see any need to pay them anymore, give them any better conditions, because what are they going to do? Where are they going to go? You know, they need to make money. They need to live. They don't have any better options. Karl Marx is saying you do have a better option. Stand in solidarity against this and say, no, we will not work in these conditions anymore. And of course, at the beginning, you're going to have a whole bunch of opposition. And maybe there's, some violence and maybe some people die. But eventually, if the vast majority of the workers just say we won't work under these conditions, you're going to end up negotiating. Because the top 1%, they cannot maintain their luxurious style of life if the majority of people, the laborers, stop laboring so that they can make the profits necessary to perpetuate that higher quality of life. So they're going to end up negotiating. Here's the thing that all of this is like leading up to the conclusion. Here's the conclusion, what you need to know. What Karl Marx hates about religion is that, first of all, it empowers the dominant. It tells you that somehow the people that are in control, God's put in control on purpose, even if they're unrighteous people. Sometimes God puts unrighteous people in control, and, you're supposed to honor them. And that's a teaching that obviously today we interpret differently, and we say in some situation maybe it applies, some situation it doesn't. But that's something that people have been taught for, a couple thousand years by this time. And then again, the idea that the sufferings of this life are not worthy to be compared with what's going to be revealed in us. Now, the reason that the people would not hear Karl Marx's message, I'm talking about the many people that are virtually enslaved in the factories, the reason they will not respond to Karl Marx's message and rebel and strike and stand in solidarity against these conditions is because of religious legitimation. God has put them in that situation, and it is their faith to accept God's will and to be faithful where God has put them. So they don't want to rebel because they think they might be going against God's will and losing the whole reason they're going through this crappy life anyway, and that is the hope of heavenly benefit. So it's for this later benefit that, of course, Karl Marx doesn't believe exists. He's a philosophical atheist. But he's a humanitarian. He wants people to have better lives, but he can't get the working class to rebel. They're afraid of losing God's grace, God's power. So he has a very important quote, and you might have heard it, that religion is the opiate of the masses. Sometimes you'll see the opium of the masses. Opium, an opiate is any class of drugs today that is related to opium, which comes from the opium poppy. And back before we started synthesizing these kinds of drugs, you basically had opium and you had morphine, and then later on you had heroin, and these were all derivatives of this. And today, of course, we have all kinds of synthetic forms of morphine. We call them opiates, even though they don't come from a poppy. Things like Dilaudid, which is kind of like a synthetic morphine. And he says it's the opiate of the masses because it dulls their pain. As they're living this horrible life, they're not really feeling how horrible it is because somehow they believe that glory is waiting for them and they're pleasing God. And this is the opium that makes it okay. Now, this is actually a great metaphor. Anybody ever done morphine? I ask classes sometimes in person, and nobody dares to raise their hand. And then I say, no. Has anyone done morphine like legally. You were like in the hospital or something. And then all of a sudden 5 or 6 hands go up and, I wasn't asking you guys if you were a drug pusher, okay? Once for me, and this is a number of years ago, but had horrible pain, found out later on it was a kidney stone. But to make a long story really short, when I was in the emergency room with my best friend Caleb, who'd driven me to the hospital, I was actually supposed to be giving a final exam that day. All those students got A's because I couldn't make it in to give the final exam. Now, don't you be praying for me to get a kidney stone when it's time for your final exam, because this is being graded online. It won't change anything. But anyway, when I was in the emergency room in so much pain, finally, a doctor came in and hit me up with Dilaudid. And as I felt the rush and all the pain subside, I looked at my friend Caleb and I said, now I fully understand how people get addicted to this stuff. Because when you're doing morphine, everything is fine. Problems, they're fine. Hey, there's a tornado coming right for you. Ah, it's pretty. It's fine. That's a great metaphor, because that's what it did. It just made the worst situation you could live in fine with them. So that's what I'd like you to understand about Karl Marx, because he's speaking to how religion legitimates social stratification. And he's looking mainly at Christianity here, because that's the main legitimation in the society that he's in here. Now, what's really interesting about Karl Marx, and if you are from South America, you probably know this, but there is a movement in theology we're not going to talk about in this class, but in REL-2000 we do talk about it. It's called liberation theology. And the idea is you take the, if you're Christian, for instance, the teachings of Jesus, and you see implied in them a responsibility to make society as ethical as you can. And this may call for a revolution. So some people see Jesus as this kind of revolutionary. Well, remember, Karl Marx is calling for the same kind of revolution. And you say, yeah, but they're so different. Well, not really. Because Karl Marx doesn't have anything against Jesus at all. Jesus shook up the system and preferred people that were socially disadvantaged. So, Karl Marx has nothing against Jesus. It's Christianity and the way Christianity is operating in the social context of the Industrial Revolution that Karl Marx hates. And many theologians argue that if Karl Marx ever met Jesus, they'd probably get along famously, because they're both humanitarians. They're both preferring those who are of less repute in society. And so in South America, in many liberation theological movements, sometimes where, guerrilla armies take over governments that are oppressive and stuff, if they're appealing to religious principles, a lot of them, their two biggest heroes are Jesus Christ and Karl Marx. And they don't see any contradiction whatsoever in how they're taking their message and applying it to their specific situation, fighting against oppression. And again, you see this a lot in South America. So I know growing up in this country, you may not have never thought about Karl Marx this deeply, but if you take an intro to sociology course, it might be a really good thing to escape from some of these things that you've been programmed to believe in our society, assuming that you're American and you're listening, because these are the college courses I teach in America. So if you're listening from somewhere else, welcome, but this is the way it looks in America. And so obviously, Karl Marx is so much more than the pesky demon he's been made out to be by some conservative theologians. All right, moving on. Sigmund Freud. Religion accompanies a universal guilty neurosis, a mental and emotional disease. I'm not going to talk as much about Freud. Freud gets a lot of cred because as one of the fathers of psychoanalysis, he went where nobody went before, and those who are on the cutting edge of any kind of a discipline, they get some particular honor. For instance, in anthropology, Tyler and Fraser are given a great deal of honor, and Spencer and many other people, because they're kind of trailblazers. But take James Fraser, for instance, as much as he's still, thank you so much for opening up this field of study, Mr. Fraser. Most of the things he taught, people don't believe anymore. They were really nice speculations that got us thinking, but we've rejected most of them. And that's the way it is with Freud. Now, we have a number of Freudianisms, sayings that we still use today, but most of the things that Freud taught, you're not going to find psychoanalysts or psychologists that believe this stuff or are basing their psychoanalytical therapies on Freudian concepts. But in terms of religion, and this is the main thing that we're dealing with, Freud is also a philosophical atheist, hates religion. He saw his father, who was a Jew, actually feign conversion to Christianity and pretend to be a Christian because it offered him more business advantages as a merchant. And Freud despised that, and he ended up despising religion altogether for so many other reasons. But the reason that even though Freud is the master of circular reasoning, and it's so easy to shoot down some of his ideas, the reason some of them resonate so deeply is because they really do relate to the human condition. They really relate to things that we feel. For instance, when he says that religion is a guilty neurosis, I'm going to tell you what, reading sophomore essays of people that have started to take one of my Intro to Religion classes, there's always a number of them that they used to be involved in some kind of religious community or something like that, and they no longer are because they thought somehow this was going to make them a happier person or give them a better life, or and all it does is make them feel guiltier and more like just a horrible, terrible sinner, and they finally leave because it's not working for them. And a lot of people can relate to this. So when you call religion, a guilty neurosis, a lot of people are like, yeah, that. And whether it's the neurosis or whether the guilty neurosis is the symptom or whether the religion is the symptom of the guilty neurosis, I don't know. In circular reasoning, it goes back and forth. Is it the disease or the symptom? But the idea is all of us, we have some kind of a universal neuroses. All humans have it, where for some reason we feel guilty. And I won't go into all of Freud's reasons for why he thinks that because nobody really believes them anymore today. But people do feel guilty. And so people are looking for some kind of a release of their guilt, some kind of a reconciliation or absolution or something. And so they come to religion looking for release from guilt. But ironically, religion too often doesn't release them from guilt. It exacerbates it. It basically says, yeah, you feel guilty and you should because you're a horrible sinner. And, and the idea in some religionist minds, apparently, is that the more they remind you that you're a horrible sinner and the worse you feel about yourself as a sinner, the more likely you are to leave the church and go through the next week without sinning because you feel so bad about it, you're going to take more seriously, the goal not to sin. But it doesn't work that way. And I mean, Freud knows it doesn't work that way. He's got that right, whatever else he's got wrong. And that is people can only bear so much guilt. If you're trying to motivate people to do good things by loading them with ever increasing loads of guilt, you're going to lose them at some point. At some point, they're just going to say, F this, I'm done. Just like so many of my students have said at a young age of 20 or whatever, in their sophomore essays, they've already gone through this and rejected it. So that's why this rings a bell so much. But he does focus on the fact that one of the things that humans are really looking for from religion is release from guilt, because they have a higher ethic than they can live up to, going back to Feuerbach there, and they're looking for some kind of a forgiveness or remission of sins, and religion promises that, but in a sense, the only remission from sins there is in acknowledging what a horrible sinner you are. And yes, in a sense, you are accepting forgiveness, but the forgiveness only seems to work if you're constantly sad about what a horrible sinner you are. And so you live the rest of your life just so sad that you're a horrible sinner, always begging for forgiveness. And there's supposed to be some kind of like inner fulfillment and joy in living that way. And so many people have not found that to be the case. They're not denying that they're sinners, but they want to have some kind of a vision that they can be better people. And I guess a lot of religion is not teaching people that they can be better people. Sometimes they're just exacerbating the guilt. And so this is what Freud's pointing out. And obviously, these three have really nothing good to say about religion at all. Now, this is not always true of all atheists. And when we were talking about definitions of religion, I might have mentioned that you would think that believers would tend to have a more positive view of religion and how it works in people's lives. Speaking about functional definitions of religions, we call these people functionalists or functionalism, behavioral scientists and stuff. Though you might think that a theist or a believer would be more likely to see religion in a good light and an atheist in a bad light. And although you'd probably be right a large part of the time, that's not always the case. I can be a believer and say I have an intimate relationship with God, I love him, but at the same time I can look back at history, and if I'm a historian, I can tell you honestly, religion has legitimated some of the worst wars and conflicts where thousands and thousands of innocent people were killed, and it was legitimated religiously somehow. Religiously legitimated by religion. Tongue twister. And so I might be a believer that tells you that religion really has been has had some horrible effects in international relations throughout human history. So you can be a believer and see bad things in how religion works. But it also works the other way around. You can actually be a philosophical atheist and see good things in the way religion works. Durkheim is a good example of this. Durkheim is a philosophical atheist, socialist. He's not a socialist, he's a sociologist. But he actually thinks religion has been a good thing in human civilization. He does not think we would have achieved the level of peaceful civilization we have had it not been for religious legitimation. And again, to once again introduce that sociological term, legitimation, a religion, when you say it legitimates something, it's adding a validity to it, almost a sacred validity. So, you know, if the law says don't kill your neighbor, and the reason that you're not killing your neighbor is because you don't want to go to prison, that's a pretty powerful, that convinces me to be good. But there's a more powerful argument, and that is if you kill your neighbor, you know, God despises that and he'll burn you in hell forever. Now I've got a much better reason not to kill my neighbor. And that, simply put, is religious legitimation. It's the same kind of thing with doing good things. If you're only doing good things to be recognized in this world or for whatever benefit you're getting in this world, some people might choose not to do them. But if you can convince people that even if they do not have a benefit for their good works in this life, in fact, they may even have some kind of repercussions that cost them something, nonetheless, the reward that they're getting later on is worth it. That's also religious legitimation. So Durkheim thinks that religion has actually given people better reasons to love their neighbors themselves, better reasons to live ethically and to compel the other people that they are in relationship with in society to live ethically, and he gives religion credit for that. Now, he's a philosophical atheist, doesn't think that God exists, but thinks that religion has been a good thing in history. Now, most philosophical atheists, educated people, are at the point where they think that at this point we finally should be like letting go of whatever, you know, ancient superstitions or whatever. If you've done intro to anthropology, you know, Tyler and Fraser would call that like an ancient survival, some superstition that survives from ancient history that really doesn't serve us well today. And it never worked back then, but it worked somehow. It provided our needs somehow. And the best example I can give you, and I may have used this before, is a security blanket. You know, when you've got a 2-year-old child, say, that's having a hard time sleeping at night because they're afraid of the monsters under the bed, and you give them this nice fluffy blue blanket and you say, hold this, and the monsters can't hurt you if you're holding the blanket. And it works. Kid sleeps like a baby. Well, he is a baby. But question is, did the blanket work? Well, you have to specify the question. Did the blanket have power over monsters and keep the monsters away, which implies the monsters exist? No, no, and no. But what was the real goal? The real goal was to get to have this small child that can't understand the reality of things very well, to just give them some kind of temporary peace so that they can sleep at night. If that was your goal, then that monster blanket worked great. Now, you're expected, of course, to grow up at some point and move beyond that blanket and realize, the blanket really did nothing. I just needed it when I was 2 years old. And by the way, there are many stories of kids that are like 5 years old and the parents keep trying to take the blanket away and throw it out in the trash, and the kid finds it and brings it back inside. And I mean, it's a major conflict to get the kid to let go of it. But sooner or later, the kid's going to have to. He's going to have to grow up. What you don't expect to see is you don't expect to see the kid grow up, get 3 or 4 degrees, end up on the board of a major corporation, going through a merger, come to a meeting, of the board, wearing a $5,000 Armani suit, and he's got this tattered blue blanket over his shoulder that he's still carrying because he thinks that the merger is going to go better if he has Blanky with him. This is exactly the way philosophical atheists see modern human beings, with all the advances we've made scientifically, still hanging on to some of these ancient superstitions. But even though Durkheim, to some sense, shares that as a philosophical atheist, he does say that throughout history, religion's actually been a good thing. You know, it's helped us to become more civilized and more peaceful. So, great example of a philosophical atheist that actually thinks religion, sociologically speaking, has been a good thing. Erich Fromm, religion provides a stable frame of reference. So much else he said, but I just want to point out, the world is always changing. And anything that you trust in, I mean, the foundation might be ripped out from under your feet at any moment. There's just not that much that you can always count on. In fact, the only thing that you can count on that doesn't change is the fact that change is a reality. The only thing that doesn't change is change itself. So people are looking for stability. They want something that's always true. They want, here's a technical term for you, they want an unconditioned reality. In other words, when something is conditional, it means there's all kinds of different conditions that change things all the time. And as the conditions that are out of your control are changing, your reality is changing. And the change cannot be stopped, nor can you control it and make it go in the way you want to, for the most part. So people want a stable frame of reference, something that's true, that's always going to be true. You may have heard the saying, an anchor for your soul, a solid rock foundation, something that doesn't get shaken. An anchor that holds you so you don't get blown about by the winds on a tumultuous sea. So they're looking for that stability. They're looking for some unconditioned reality that never changes, that is always true. William James, we talked about him a lot. And remember the wonderful quote that was actually one of the most masterful quotes dealing with the substance of religion. That's why we call it a substantive definition. And I won't rehash that here, but William James talks an awful lot in a book called The Varieties of Religious Experience, looking at many people that have had transformative religious experiences. We talked about this going back through the transformation section of the Features of Religion a few videos back here, but does talk about how these transformations tend to change people's lives. And he does note that religious experience, real religious experience that's transformative, tends to provide an increased sense of peace, security, harmony, and meaning in your life. Humans are always looking for meaning and purpose. The idea that all of this suffering is chaotic and means nothing is very, very hard to bear. And so these are just things that William James is noting. And by the way, you see the superscript 2 at the end of William James's last name, and you look down at the bottom and you look at the note. It says, though James is mentioned on page 9, his views on the usefulness of religious experience are not presented by Fisher. So this thing that I just showed you here, I put it up myself, but you won't find it in the book. But it does discuss William James, and of course we discussed him before. Frederick Strang, religion provides a mean to ultimate transformation. And again, maybe I should have switched them around and done Strang before James, because Strang is basically talking about that is what people seek. There's something about our life that is unsatisfactory, and everybody would like to see something change to make your life more satisfactory, less screwed up. And so that's the promise that religion makes, is that somehow if you get back in harmony with the ultimate, you're going to have a better life, a higher quality of life. I mean, less suffering, or your sufferings will be more meaningful, or something. Okay. So a transformation that increases the quality of your life. And religion very much has to have that transformative element in it, or we probably wouldn't qualify it as religion per se, according to any definition of religion that I would propose. There has to be some kind of idea of transformative experience. Various kinds of religious experience here in the subnote 3 here. Various kinds of religious experience bringing transformation are identified in this chapter here. In the faith perspective section, pages 9 to 11, it talks about that. But again, I haven't divided these up according to Mary Pat Fisher's divisions in the book. Rudolf Otto, this is important. Now, Rudolf Otto is a believer. By the way, when you get to Fromm and James and Strang and Otto, now you're to the believers. These people, may not agree with some of the more archaic ideas of what God is or how God is, but they do believe that God exists. Something exists. Rudolf Otto is more recent. And by the way, Rudolf Otto is one of a number of different people that we might call phenomenologists that are studying religious experience. So William James could fall in that category too, because he's studying religious. You could call him a psychologist. You could call him a philosopher. Was a Harvard professor. But you could also call him a phenomenologist, studying the experience, religious experience. And we're talking about transformative experience. Usually when we talk about transformative experience, there's two characteristics. In fact, I think at the bottom of this, Joachim Vogt will show you the two characteristics here at the bottom. But one is that it affects all of your being. I mean, every part of your life, every area you're involved with anything, because it changes your idea of who you are and why you are. It changes every area of your life. It doesn't just change what you do at 11 a.m. on a Sunday morning. And secondly, it's enduring. It's not just a fad that you're over in 6 months. And we'll see that. So assuming this is real religious experience, a transformational experience that convinces you of the reality of God and changes your life for the better, Rudolf Otto calls this, he has a name for it. He calls it Mysterium Tremendum et Fascinans. And it means the mystery. And I mean, not just mystery like a crime mystery. I mean, a mystery that the human brain is just incapable of fully plumbing the depths of, fully seeking out. Tremendum implies terror. You think of the word tremendous, but we've changed the meaning of words a lot. One way to think of it is think of tremors. When you're really, really afraid, how you're just shaking uncontrollably, think of that when you see tremendum. And fascinans is fascination. I mean, just awe, just at the beauty, and just you're just intoxicated by how desirable something is. So what he's saying is, these kind of experiences throughout human history, we see so many examples of these kind of experiences, that where you're beholding the mystery of God or the mystery of your connection to God, but you are having such a profound experience of God's presence, the holiness of God, that you are absolutely terrified. I mean, beyond normal fear, beyond, you're in the presence of something upon whom your whole existence is contingent. You only exist because this thing wills for you to exist. And there's something terrifying about that. You know, you're seeing something that will probably be the undoing of you, and yet you can't turn away or run away because you're in love with it. You've fallen in love with it. You're already addicted to the terror, to the feeling. And by the way, there are many poets who've written about this experience, and they've actually said that when something like this happens, you can actually see how closely terror and love are related. And so when you say fear of God, it's not just the fear that God's going to punish you or the fear that you're going to lose God, but it's this just intense reverence, awe, you know, of the majesty of God, this fascination that you're terrified at how powerful and great and wonderful he is, but you're falling in love with it at the same time. And so they're actually saying that this terror and this deepest kind of love are not contradictory at all. They go together really, really well. And true love of God, you're not going to have unless you have some sense of that deepest of all terrors. And, you know, you're not going to be able to experience that deepest of terrors before God, at least not in this life, without seeing that beauty, seeing that fascination, developing some kind of love for that you're terrified of. If you haven't had an experience like this might sound very, very strange, but throughout history, people have talked about this. Let me say this. There's some other people besides Otto that are famous for talking about this. One's is a German, another German, whose name is Friedrich Schleiermacher, and he comes before Otto, but Schleiermacher is famous for coining this word in German, creatureliness, and coming into the presence of God really just shines the light on the fact that you exist in the mind of God, in the will of God, because God wants you to exist, you exist, and you're coming into the presence of that which is chosen that you exist, and at any moment technically could change his mind. And there's something about just that utter creatureliness, that your whole existence is contingent on this higher being's will for you to exist, that is part of the terror, but also part of the love. Another guy is Dutch, I believe, Gerard van der Leeuw. And he also talks about many of the same things, and why they might use some different phrases, they're all focusing on the same thing. And William James also, they all kind of fit in this category of these just marvelous transformations. And again, we talked about William James's book before. So Rudolf Otto, when he talks about an encounter with the holy, he's not just using holy to mean faultless. He means wholly other. It's a play on words, because obviously H-O-L-Y and W-H-O-L-L-Y are different words. But when he says holy, he means completely and utterly other. In other words, this is not like anything you've ever experienced before. There's a lot of things we're afraid of, and we'll talk a lot about this later in the course. There's a lot of things we're afraid of, but we're used to being afraid of them. When I get on the highway and drive 80 miles an hour, there's always the chance I'm going to die in a horrible wreck. And, you know, while that is a valid fear, we have to do this every day if you live in a major city, and you have to get somewhere, so you learn to live with it. But when you are exposed to a terror, unlike anything you've ever experienced, that's really disconcerting. That takes it to another level. So he's talking about the holy other. And he always uses the capital O on other, because it's the holy other. It's absolutely terrifying, because it's beyond anything. It's still a mystery. You can't even comprehend the depth of what it is, but its whole being is just, I don't know, is being imposed upon you in such a way that is causing the most profound dread. the most profound terror, and yet the deepest reverence and love. So the holy other. Many examples of this. You see them especially in devotional religions like Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and Hinduism, devotional Hinduism, where people, we'll talk about this in the Bhagavad Gita. There's actually a prince named Arjuna that comes into the presence of the great god Vishnu, and it's the same, it's Mysterium Tremendum et Fascinans, it's shock and awe, to see God's glory. And of course you see it in the Bible, Isaiah chapter 6, where Isaiah is caught up into the throne room of God. And I mean, he is so terrified he falls on his face and his muscles won't even work. I mean, he has no power to even stand up. He's so devastated. We see this over and over again. In fact, in the very last book in the Christian New Testament, at the beginning of the book, one of Jesus's disciples named John has been exiled to the island of Patmos, and Jesus appears before him in glory. And this is probably at least 40 years, maybe as much as 60 years after Jesus' crucifixion and ascension to heaven and whatever. But John was like Jesus' best friend on earth. I mean, he was the disciple that was like, the best buddy to Jesus, and Peter was pretty close too, but those two especially. And so he's seeing someone he has no reason to fear. He's seeing his beloved Jesus in glory before him, and even though he trusts Jesus and loves him and has no reason to fear him, when he sees him in his glorified state, he falls on his face in terror and cannot get up. We see this many, many times. So, Rudolf Otto. Joachim Bach, this is what I talked about. Genuine experience of this unseen reality intensely affects a person's entire being, resulting in an enduring transformation. It goes on. Whatever, turn you took at this point, you continue to go in a new direction. You don't come back to where you were before and try the other turn again. We do that a lot today. That's faddish, but no. Enduring transformation and a motivation to action. Now, what that means here, very simply, is that if you really believe something that affects who you see yourself to be, and why you see yourself to exist, and what your responsibility is to be a blessing to other people or to be involved in situations you come into in a positive way, you have a responsibility to act in that way. You have a responsibility to be the person you're supposed to be in that situation. And so while you cannot read someone's mind, let's see if they really believe what they say they believe. No, you can't ever do that. You can't read their mind or their heart. But when you see how this transformation continues to affect their life and their whole understanding of who and why they are on an ongoing basis, you can't prove scientifically that they experienced God whatsoever. Maybe it was a horrible hallucination, some people might think. But you cannot deny the fact that you can see clearly their entire life began to change radically at this point and continued changing according to that new dynamic. And that's the kind of thing behavioral scientists like to study, while humanities scholars like to look more at the experience itself and the kind of symbolism we use to refer to God and how we represent God in everything from theology to poetry to art to drama to, music, whatever. And by the way, slightly off the subject here, I'll just throw in, I think I might have mentioned it earlier, but there is sometimes this strange conflict that needs not to exist, in my opinion, between those who study religion within the behavioral sciences, like sociology and psychology, and those who study religion within what we might call more the humanities approach versus the behavioral scientific approach. Humanities approach is about how humans construct meaning and purpose, and how humans create value judgments, and then how they use symbolism to represent that which is of the highest ethic or the highest aesthetic. That's humanities. And honestly, I think you have to do both. I think if you're in the middle of this conflict where you're polarized and you think it has to be one way or the other, I think you're missing something in the study of religion. So I see the value in both sides. I wish we could just agree that both sides are necessary and have, I think that we need to be talking about what humans think something means, even if you can't prove that it's real. It's real to them, so it's okay to look at how it feels and what they think and how they represent it. And then you move on to the behavioral scientific and you go, and now how does it affect them in their life? How can I observe them acting differently because of that in a sociological context or in terms of their personal psychology or whatever? And we've talked about that. Finally, as you go through the rest of this chapter, I just want to point out a few things. And if you did your job and actually read through the chapter, And this is probably the only chapter I will tell you you really should have read at all. The others, like I mentioned, you see page numbers, you can focus on them. But even though this is pages 2 to 11, there's other things in this chapter. When we get past this on page 11, Understandings of Ultimate Reality and so on, they start talking about theisms. Now remember, we had a video on theisms. And what you're going to notice here is there are some different terms here. First of all, it talks about humanism versus secularism. And in my opinion, they're kind of mixing like two different areas, conceptual areas here, which is fine. But there's also a term, for instance, non-theistic, non-theism. And they're using this to refer to any religion that is sees that there is a flaw with our perception, that there is some better reality we're not fully perceiving, and being able to perceive or be enlightened and see that fuller reality will cause some kind of a positive transformation in our life that will lessen our suffering, but does not necessarily believe that there is some higher entity involved in orchestrating this or in charge of the whole transformation or fulfilling his will or whatever. The book would call that non-theistic. So in a sense, we're looking at something that fits the definition of religion. Because there is a higher reality that we're not in touch with, we want to get in touch with it because we realize that getting in touch with it is going to increase the quality of our life. That's religion. But it's possible to have those religious aspects, but not actually think that there is some kind of a God that has a will that you would do this. And a real good example of this is Theravada Buddhism, which we'll talk about when we get to it. So I didn't use this as a category because it's more of a characteristic than a category. Okay, there are some different kinds of religions that you might say, okay, this particular, we divide this in like 4 different categories of, Buddhism. And in this category of Buddhism, like Theravada, we would say that this is by definition non-theistic because of exactly what I just explained to you. So that's a term that you would see in there. So you're going to see some different conceptual frameworks, some different ways of defining terms. That's why I wanted to give you my introduction first. Goes on and talks about symbolism. Responses to modernity. Now, we have not really talked that much about the response to modernity, the encounter between science and religion, and so on. I hope you've read this section of the chapter. And then going on, of course, women in religion. This is huge over the last couple hundred years, especially. Women's status in many of the world religions has changed radically in the right direction. And, some, of course, we might critique because we say they're not moving quickly enough. Finally, negative aspects of organized religions, just quickly introduced, and we've talked about some of these, like the guilty neurosis and so on. Lenses for studying religions. Obviously, there's many different kinds of studies you can do and many different ways to carry them out. We've talked about a few distinctions, but read that short section. It's just an introduction. Key terms, hopefully you'll look through those. Some good terms to know, just helps you to communicate. And the next chapter on indigenous religions, you'll notice is not on the schedule. We don't have time to go through it. And I wish we could because it's so interesting. But the very next video, we're going to be talking about primal to archaic transition. And this is about the agricultural revolution and how it changes the earliest form of human society, these small hunter-gatherer tribal family groups that are nomadic, wandering around looking for food, to how not only human society and culture, but also human religion changes when humans learn how to domesticate agriculture and stay in one place. And in this study that's coming up, I think when we get done with that study, if then you had time and you wanted to go and read the chapter on indigenous sacred ways, I think it might inform somewhat your understanding of the differences between the early tribal societies in prehistoric humanity, because some of the characteristics of that are still present in these indigenous societies, and then understanding how, with the agricultural revolution, the major civilizations grew and developed and evolved in a way that these separate kind of tribal societies did not. And I think that chapter 2 will make a lot more sense if you want to read it after we go through that primal to archaic study. I wish we had time to go through it as part of the course, but I do encourage you to read it. Until next time, take care.